So today's webinar is titled Writing Your Wilderness Resume, Applying for Outdoor Jobs and Certifications. So I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Kat Wood, and I use she and her pronouns. I've been working in outdoor education for over 14 years, and I've been working with Outward Bound for the last 11 years. And I'm a full-time instructor with the Training Academy, and I work in the Canadian Rockies in Alberta. Sort of little bit about my work experience. I've worked with pretty big variety of groups, including youth and adults. Mostly I teach backpacking and a little bit of rock climbing. And I also have a background in wilderness therapy. So I worked with a land-based addictions treatment center for about 10 years. And my education is in adventure guiding and social work. Just gonna see if I can change this slide here. And then on this slide, you can see some of my certifications. So I'm an ACMG assistant hiking guide, top rope climbing instructor, wilderness first aid, and a variety of other things. And so this webinar is focusing on writing a wilderness resume to apply for jobs and certifications. And so a lot of the kind of advice or tips and tricks that I'm included is based off of my personal experience of having gone through these different certification processes. Also want to let you know that my colleague Brandon Boltz is here. So you might see that there's two accounts labeled Outward Bound Canada. And so he is on the other account, and he's going to be helping moderate the question and answer period at the end. So I'd like to start by putting a little bit of context to where I am geographically. So Outward Bound Canada operates all across the country. And where I live and where I work is in the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. And these eastern slopes are really like interesting terrain because stretching out to the east, you have this relatively flat prairie and foothill. And then where I live, it's this dramatic transition where the land's pushed up into these really dramatic, steep, cliffy, rocky mountains. And so the land I'm describing is on traditional Treaty 7 territory, which is the territory of the Iarhe Nakota, which is the Bears Paw First Nation, Chiniki First Nation, and Goodstoney First Nation, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Blackfoot Confederacy, which is the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani. And this is also Métis District 4 within the Battle River Territory. So that's a bit of an acknowledgement of the territory that I'm on. But I also know in this webinar, people are joining from all across Turtle Island, all across Canada. And so if you don't know what traditional territory you're located on, I'd really encourage you to learn. So there's a website, you can see I've included it on this slide on the top left, which is native-land.ca. And it's a great resource that maps out territories. And so if you go on that, you'll see a map of all of Canada, and you can zoom in to the specific area that you're in, and it has a lot of resources regarding what territory that is, what languages are spoken, and yeah, just information and resources to learn more about the land that you're on. So if you're not already familiar with that website, I would really encourage you to check it out and learn a little bit more. So again, that's native-land.ca. So in this webinar, I'm going to outline what a wilderness resume is, why they're used, when you might submit one, what they look like and how you write one, and how to tailor your wilderness resume for specific applications, whether that's you're wanting to apply for a particular job or a particular type of certification. And I wanted to do this webinar because I've noticed that most organizations require that applicants submit a wilderness resume when they apply for something. But despite this, there isn't a lot of information explaining how to write one or what one is. So I'm not going to be discussing writing a more traditional resume or cover letter because there's already a lot of online and community resources that can help with those. This is really focusing on something called a wilderness resume, which kind of comes in addition to a traditional resume or a cover letter, and is really specific to the outdoor industry. So our time together is scheduled for 1 hour, and there'll be a question and answer period at the end. And so if you have questions that come up, please feel free to just put them in the chat. We're not going to be answering them until the end, but if halfway through something comes up that you're wondering about, put it in, and then at the end of the presentation, we can kind of circle back and make sure that we've answered all of those. Okay, so to start off with, I want to answer, what is a wilderness resume? So a wilderness resume refers to a document that captures specific details about your personal and professional outdoor experience. Different organizations might call it different things. Most commonly, it gets called a wilderness resume, a trip log, a logbook, or an experience vitae. And so these are all different names, but they're actually all referring to the same type of document. As I said earlier, it's typically submitted in addition to a more traditional resume and cover letter, but it's distinct from those two documents as its purpose is to detail objective information about each personal and professional trip that you've done, outdoor trip. So you can think of it as a bit of a who, what, when, where, and why of all the outdoor trips that you've done. So why are they used and how are they different than a regular resume? So a wilderness resume captures more detail than just employment history would. So an example of this is, for me, one summer season, I worked with Outward Bound and I taught over 60 field days in that one season. Whereas a different summer, I was dealing with some injuries and I actually only taught 7 field days throughout the whole summer. And on a regular kind of traditional resume that just lists the years that you work for somewhere, that kind of level of detail wouldn't be captured. You couldn't see the difference between working 7 days and 60 days. Whereas on a wilderness resume, it will show exactly how much field time you've had in each year or in each season. It also serves to paint a more detailed picture of your level of experience and skills. So, for example, if you're applying for a job as a raft guide, your wilderness resume will give a lot more relevant details on things like, has your experience been guiding day trips for youth on a summer camp on class 1 and 2 water, or have you guided multi-week trips in class 4 rapids? And then finally, the wilderness resume is factual and objective. So it includes less of a narrative than a cover letter would, or even a standard resume would. And this provides a really clear overview of your experience that's easy for other people to look at and interpret and understand. Okay, so that's why they're used. And next up is, what do they get used for? So you'll often be asked to submit one when you're applying for a job, when you're negotiating decisions about pay scale, and that could be either when you first get hired or later if you're asking for a raise, and also when applying for certifications, either the first time you apply for a cert as part of a yearly maintenance, or sometimes certifications require like an ongoing recertification and proof of experience or certain days out. So job applications, pay scale, and certifications are kind of the main times that you'll have to submit one. And so for me personally, I've worked in the outdoor industry for 14 years and I've submitted them pretty frequently. So I've been with Outward Bound for 11 consecutive years, and every single year that I rejoin with Outward Bound, I submit a wilderness resume that's been updated since the year before. Um, and I've submitted one every time I've applied for new jobs, including short single contracts. So sometimes I'll just pick up, even 2 or 3 days of work or a week of work if I'm filling in to kind of cover for someone at an organization I don't typically work for. And so even if it's just that few days of work, I'll often be asked to submit one before I kind of join on. Um, and then I also have used my wilderness resume to ask for a raise. Many employers in the outdoor industry have pay scales that are based on the number of field days that you've worked. So all that to say, it's super helpful to have a wilderness resume that you just update a few times a year, or even after each trip, rather than having to think back and try and remember, what trips you did, what the dates were, those sorts of things, and trying to remember years back when it comes time to apply for something. So the next thing I want to get into is, what does a wilderness resume look like? So there is no single standardized format. Many employers or organizations provide a form that they want you to use, sometimes an Excel sheet, but this format isn't consistent between different organizations. As well as sometimes organizations will just ask you to submit a wilderness resume, but they don't actually say specifically what they want you to have in it. But that's not as hard to navigate as it might sound, because there's general information that most organizations want. So for me, I keep a general wilderness resume that I just update on an ongoing way. And then it's really easy for me to copy and paste that information into specific formats when I need to, because I just have all the relevant information. And then when I'm applying for something, it's really more of a matter of formatting than it is trying to figure out what content to put in it, because I just have everything up to date. Certifications tend to be the most specific types of wilderness resumes that you'll need to submit. Those most often do use Excel forms. And I'm going to discuss applying for specific certifications a little bit later in this presentation. So I recommend that anyone who is wanting to work in the outdoor sector keep a general wilderness resume, so that you have one spot that just has all of your trips recorded and you can use it as needed. And I'm going to start this presentation by showing you how you write one of those. And then I'll discuss more how you might tailor that general resume to apply for a particular job or certification. So if you have a specific goal in mind, you can write your wilderness resume in a way that focuses more specifically on that goal. So the first part, I'm just going to talk in general, how do you write a wilderness resume that you can kind of tailor and use for whatever? And then in the second half of the presentation, how do you write one that's more specific to a particular employer or certification that you're trying to achieve? So yeah, I'll start by talking about that general wilderness resume. Wilderness resume typically would have 3 sections. So the first section is for your professional trips, the second for personal trips, and the third place as somewhere to list your certifications. And I'm going to talk about each of these separately. So the first section for your professional experience includes trips that you're being paid to work, or organized trips that you're volunteering with where you're in a leadership role. So the categories that you'll include on that are the company or organization name, the dates and number of days that you're out, your role, the type of trip, so the activity you're doing, the location you're in, and then a place for comments. And comments can include things like the number of participants, the demographic of the participants, if there's an intention of the trip you're on, or anything noteworthy weather conditions, that sort of thing. So all of that information that I just read out on the last slide is typically formatted in a table like this. And so on the next slide, I'm going to give some more examples and details about each section, but just so you can see, this here is the general layout that you're going to use. So there's a lot of text on this slide, but it's just sort of breaking down examples about what each category is a little bit more specifically. So the company or organization name, that's pretty straightforward, just the name of who you're working for. So examples of places I've worked would be Outward Bound, Inimoyas, Knowles, yeah, just the name of wherever you're working. With days, it's the total number of field days. So if you have a job where you have some office days where you don't have participants and you're getting ready for the trip, you don't count those in the total number of days. You can think of it as the number of days is like how many days are you out in the woods with students or with participants. And then you also want to include the date and the year. So for your role, some examples that you might be in would be volunteer, camp counselor, assistant instructor, tail guide, instructor, lead instructor. And if you're not sure what your title is, you could check in with the organization who you're working with and just see what language they use. So the type of trip, sometimes trips will have a program name, so you can include that. And then just what type of activity it is. So, you know, is it hiking, climbing, sea kayaking, whitewater canoeing? Yeah, just what activity were you doing? For the location, you want to include sort of a medium level of detail. So for example, if you're working in a particular park, then you're going to include the name of the park and the province. And so in this case, you don't need to include like the name of the trailhead that you're at or specific GPS coordinates of where you are. It's just sort of giving an idea of the general region that you're in. And then for comments, number of participants and demographic of participants. And really this is just to paint more of a picture of what the trip was like, because if you're out with adults who are in a therapeutic program, that's going to look a lot different than if your trip is hiking with second grade students. The particular intention of the trip, if there is one, examples of this could be maybe it's a skill building trip, instructor development, it's a mindfulness trip that includes meditation and yoga, like just kind of, again, giving a bit more detail about what type of trip it is. And then notable weather, again, this is really only if you feel like the weather shaped the experience of your trip. So maybe it was really cold, it was -25 and you're out camping at night. Or if it's super windy and that's sort of changing the activities that you're doing. And yeah, so those are sort of the types of things that you might put in each row. This next slide is an example that I've pulled directly from my own wilderness resume from 2021. And so you can see in terms of the titles of each column, it's the same as the last two slides. And you'll also see that each trip gets its own row on the table. So regardless of if it's, you know, was 1 day or it was 30 days, each trip just has one row to group it together. And so it's acting as kind of a summary of my days out. So some of you might keep field log books where you document each day that you're out in a lot of detail. with things like the coordinates of where you're camping, distance and elevation, and so on. And that's really great, and I really enjoy doing that as well. But for the purpose of a wilderness resume, you can think of it as a much more general summary. So for this one in particular, I've grouped all my outward bound trips together, number of days, and then the dates. My role on all those trips was as lead instructor. What I was talking about before with some trips have titles, so you can see Adult Mindfulness Program. That was the title of the trip, and the activity was backpacking. And then location and comments, kind of as I described on the last slide. So another thing I wanted to mention was recording your total number of days for quick reference. So this isn't required, but it can be really helpful just to keep things organized. So for me personally, this is what the very top of my wilderness resume looks like. So it's just a table, and it tallies the total of number of days that I've been out by the organizations that I've worked for, with the 3 organizations, excuse me, that I've done the most work for, and then I've grouped together a lot of other organizations that I've maybe just done, 5 or 10 or less days I've grouped together. And so use this if you find it helpful. It's not a requirement. And regardless of if you have 1 or 3 or 10 days of personal experience, this is still something that you can just get started to help you keep track of things. So a couple notes on format for the wilderness resume. How you format the overall document depends on the number of years and trips that you're keeping track of, as well as your personal preference. So you might choose to separate things out by organization, by the type of guiding you're doing, or you might just group things all together and keep it in chronological order. And so there's no particular correct way to format these, but some tips that would be really helpful is keep it in chronological order so your most recent things are at the top. Make sure that it's organized and easy to follow, and make sure it's consistent throughout the document. So whatever way of kind of formatting or grouping things together that you've chosen, it's the same, so that easy for somebody else, whether that's an employer or an organization, to look at it and kind of understand what's happening. So in the first example I showed you, I grouped all my outward bound experience together, kind of in one section. Another way that you could choose to do it is by just going by date and not employer. So you can see here, this is just in chronological order. Don't worry too much about the details on this slide. Really all I'm wanting to show is that here I have different employers and different activities mixed together, and the organizing piece of it is the date that I'm going in chronological order. And so, especially if you've worked at a variety of different places or variety of different activities, this is also a totally appropriate way to keep it organized. So the last thing I want to show in this section is the overall format. So don't worry if you can't read the small text on this slide, it's super tiny. But this is just a snapshot of my personal wilderness resume. And I've cut out a bunch of the information so that it will all fit on this one slide. But what I'm trying to highlight is, you can see on the top left on the first page, I had that chart that I showed you that just breaks down the total number of days that I've worked for each employer. And then I have my trips organized by the 3 employers that I've worked most commonly for. So you can see Outward Bound, Enviros, and Knowles. And then other professional trip experience grouped together. And so overall, my wilderness resume is a multi-page document. that has all of my trips organized and laid out, and I've done something that makes sense for me in terms of grouping together who I've worked for, keeping in chronological order, and keeping it just that consistent format again. So, moving on to the next section, I'm going to talk about your personal trips section of the resume. Um, and this is really similar to professional trips, so I'm going to cover it a little bit faster. So, many certifications only require personal experience, and employers often consider personal trip experience when assessing people's experience levels as well. So, this section is really valuable. And if you don't have any professional experience, then starting out with creating a document with only your personal experience is also a really great place to start. So it's similar to the professional section. The first things are all the same. So the dates and number of days, the trip, type of trip activity, location, and number in group is all exactly the same as what we just went through. And then what's a little bit different is you want to include your trip partner's name and contact info and the level of experience they have. And that can be sort of as simple as, does your trip partner have the same level of experience as you? Do they have less experience, and so that sort of puts you in a leadership role? Or do they have more experience, and that means that they can help mentor you a little bit? You also want to include comments. So talk about difficulty or ambition level, objectives that you had on the trip, trip highlights, notable weather, that sort of thing. So this is just an example of what a personal resume could look like. So you can see it's exactly the same table format as what we talked about for the professional section. Each trip has a different line. It's also appropriate if you say did a few day hikes with the same partner close together, then you might group those together. So you can see that first row, I have 3 different day hikes, but I've grouped them together because I'm with the same person, and it's fairly close timeline to each other. Um, and if it's an overnight trip, then you can group those things together. Day trips are also great experience. And depending on the type of activity, you can decide what details to include in the comments. So if you're rock climbing, you might want to put a little bit more detail about what routes you did, what grade they were, how long, and that sort of thing. But you can use your judgment with what seems relevant to you to put in the comments. And so the third section is for certifications or training courses. And so you'll want to include the organization, the type of training, the location, certification date, and certification expiry date, if that's applicable. Again, laid out just in a little table here. And the type of training will be the name of the certification. Some certifications, like wilderness first aid, require recertification every 3 years, and so then there'd be an expiry date that you'd have to include, whereas other certifications don't expire, although they might require paying annual dues or making sure you're meeting certain professional development pieces. And if you take a formal training course that doesn't have a certification included, you can also record those here. So that kind of covers the general wilderness resume. And so to summarize, so far we focused on 3 sections: professional, personal, and certifications. And we went through what goes in each section. Your general wilderness resume kind of includes all the information and details that you're likely to need. So then it's really easy to copy and paste that information into different formats when you're applying for things. So if there's one main takeaway so far, it's to keep your records updated if you do want to pursue work or certifications in the outdoor industry, because it's way easier to do this on an ongoing basis than trying to scramble and put it all together when it comes time to apply for something. And the process can be really fun. It's a cool way to reflect on the trips that you've done and, yeah, kind of think about where you've been and have a record of that. So the next kind of section that I want to talk about is what I'm calling a specific wilderness resume. So this applies if you have a clear goal in mind, like a job or certification course that you want to apply for. So I'm going to share some tips and then we'll go through some examples. In many cases, organizations will have information about what you need to submit for a wilderness resume. And again, these have several different names, so you might see terms like trip log, logbook, experience Vitae instead of wilderness resume, but regardless of the title, they're all referring to the same document. So if you know what you want to apply for, you can see if there's specific criteria. And you can use this to decide what you keep records of. So for example, when applying for rock climbing certifications, you'll be asked to record the route name, grade, and number of pitches, in addition to the other standard info that we discussed in the previous section. So knowing ahead of time can help you decide what you're going to keep records of. Having a specific goal, like a certification that you want, can also help you plan your recreational days. So, for example, if you want to become certified as an apprentice hiking guide, one of the things you'll need to complete is 10 hikes with a minimum elevation gain of 700 meters. So when you're planning a hiking day with friends, you can look at the elevation gain on different trails and pick one that has at least 700 meters, and then you can use that in your application. So you're sort of picking your days out based on a goal that you have specifically around a certification you're trying to get. You'll also want to check in on timelines. Some information only want information for the last 12 months, while others accept any timeline. And so if you have a long-term goal that you expect will take more than a year to prepare for, then you might need to keep certain records until you're closer. You might not need to keep certain records until you're kind of in that year time frame. And so it's helpful to know if there's a certification that you're looking for, what time frame they want the information from. And I'll just emphasize again that keeping a general wilderness resume can be really helpful for applying for something specific as well. But wait, how do I know which certifications to apply for? So if you're just getting started in the outdoor industry, it can seem really complicated to know what certifications will help you with your career. So to figure this out, you can start by just thinking about what type of activities you want to guide. Are you interested in sea kayaking, rock climbing, hiking, canoeing, fishing? Once you kind of have that more general idea of activities that you're excited about, you can do your research on which organizations certify that activity in your area. So this can start with just a really simple Google search like, how do I sea kayak guide in BC? Or how to become a rock climbing guide in Alberta. And this should give you a sense of what certifications are out there for different activity types. A next step could be to research guiding companies in your area who are doing relevant programming to what you want to do. And many websites have a staff team page that lists people's certifications. So find a company that looks really cool where you think I'd love to do that type of work, and then see who the staff are that are working there and what certifications they have. And I'll mention as well that some certifications are a good fit for people to enter into with minimal experience, and the certification will include a training course that will train you kind of from the beginning, while other certifications require that you already have extensive experience before you can apply for this certification exam. So depending on your level of experience, you can use that information to set short or long-term goals. Many organizations will also post what certifications they want employees to have. So just as an example, this page on the screen here is from Outward Bound Canada, and it lists the certifications that they want employees to have in each region. This page is available publicly on the Outward Bound Canada website. So, for example, if you wanted to teach sea kayak guiding, Outward Bound would want you to have a level 2 certification with the Sea Kayaks Guide Alliance of BC. And if this was your goal, you could then look up SKG-ABC, Sea Kayaks Guides Alliance of British Columbia, and see what prerequisites are required to take the level 2 certification. And then on this slide, this is just the second half of that document from the first page we were looking at, and it outlines certifications required in Ontario and on the East Coast. And so if you, for example, wanted to teach whitewater canoeing in Ontario, you'd need Swiftwater Rescue Technician 3, Paddle Canada Wilderness Camping Instructor, and Bronze Cross. And so this is just to give you a bit of a sense of some of the types of certifications that organizations might be looking for. I think it's also worth mentioning that some organizations might have flexibility regarding certifications. So these 2 bullet points on the screen here are from the OB website on the same page as the list of certifications that we were just looking at. So as you can see, it mentions that if you're just starting your outdoor career and either don't have all the certifications or you have beginner level certs in the area of activity that you want to work, that they might be able to put you in a training position. And it also mentions that if you have considerable experience but not certifications, that you can still apply and your experience will be assessed. And this will vary from organization to organization, but wanted to bring it to your attention as it might be worth asking if you're trying to work somewhere but you maybe don't have the certs that they're asking for. So those were some tips about how you can learn more about outdoor certifications in Canada. And I'm going to move on and go through a couple examples of using your wilderness resume to apply for certifications and jobs. And there's so many outdoor certifications in Canada that there's no way that I could go through every type of guiding certification. But my hope is just to show you a few examples to hopefully familiarize you a little bit with kind of what this process might look like. So the first example that I'm going to use is the Apprentice Hiking Guide certification with the ACMG, which is the Association of Canadian Mountain Guides. So this certification allows people to guide hiking and backpacking trips. And so if you're interested in learning more, you can check out the ACMG website. You can just Google it, or the website on that top left corner, tapacmg.ca, will bring you to all of the information about the ACMG certification courses and exams. So the Apprentice Hiking Program is the first level of 2 certifications, and it has a number of prerequisites, which I'll show you. And then to apply, you'd fill out an application that details your experience. So here's the prerequisites here. This is just taken straight from the ACMG website. So you need to be 19 years old or older, have at least 3 years hiking experience. You need to have 30-day hikes. 10 need to have at least 700 meters elevation gain or loss. 10 need to require navigation, as well as you need 20 tent-based backpacking trips, and additional prerequisite of an 80-hour wilderness first aid. So if this was a certification that you wanted to get, you need to have that experience before you applied for the exam. And the next 4 slides, I'll show you what the application looks like, which is an Excel sheet. And you can notice that the format and information included in these is really similar to what we just talked about with the general wilderness resume. So here's the first page of the application form. So as you can see, it's where you demonstrate that you meet the prerequisites of hiking experience, and each row would be a different hike that you've done. So it asks for the hike name, location, date, who you went with, same as what we talked about before. And then it also wants a yes or no for elevation gain and navigation. So again, you can see it prerequisites that they listed for the hikes that you needed and backpacking nights, and then this form is where you input specifically what you've done. This is the second page, which is for industry experience. So related work, if you have any, you'll notice that the prerequisites didn't say that you need to have any work experience. So you could still apply for this certification without having worked in the industry before. But if you have done related work, including things like interpretive work or tour guiding, this could be where you showcase it. And then the third page of the application is for other relevant personal experience. So this is recreational experiences for things other than hiking. So if you've done other types of outdoor trips like skiing, rock climbing, or paddling, or whatever, you can include that here. And again, you'll notice that the format is really similar to the information that you'd include in a general wilderness resume. The last page is for relevant courses or certifications. And again, this is going to look really similar to what we just talked about with keeping a record of your certification. This also invites training courses. So if it's a technical training, but there isn't a certification attached, they're still interested in learning about that. So that's it for the apprentice hiking guide application. You'd fill out those 4 spreadsheets and submit it. And overall, you can see again, it's fairly consistent information that they're asking for what we've asked about. And so that's why having a wilderness resume, you know, if you weren't wanting to actually fill in this application now, but maybe years down the road you did, having some of this stuff documented would be really helpful to remember, you know, when you did a certain hike or who you were with. So the next example that I'd like to show you is with the Sea Kayak Guides Alliance of BC. So this one, the font is super tiny, so don't worry if you can't read it, because I'm gonna kind of go through the relevant parts. And this document is also available publicly on their website. If you just Google Sea Kayak Guides Alliance of BC, you'll be able to find their logbook information. So this particular document is what the SKG ABC uses for people to move into a higher level of certification. So if you're interested in becoming a sea kayak guide and you don't have any certs yet, this isn't the entry level cert. So don't worry if you don't have the experience here. I just really wanted to show what it sometimes looks like to apply for certifications that require more details. So this is something that for some people might be later down the road if you don't have any sea kayaking certs, or if you already have a Sea Kayak Guide Alliance level 1 and you wanted to get a level 2, this would be sort of a piece of documentation that you'd need to fill out. So what you'll notice about this is it asks for a lot of information that's quite similar to what we talked about in the general wilderness resume. So organization, trip area, trip dates, who you're with, and a place for comments, same as before. But it also asks for some details about what boats were used, double kayaks or single kayaks. It asks for a more detailed description of the route taken, the nautical miles paddled, and the class of water. So again, if you're not a sea kayaker and you don't know what those things mean, don't worry about it. It's just an example of where more details are being asked for. So here's where, if you had a goal in mind, it's useful to research ahead of time what you're going to be asked for in the application. So if you have a level 1 certification and your goal is to do the level 2, you'd want to look at this document and make sure you're recording all the information that you need. So Whatever your goals are regarding certifications, it's really helpful to do some research ahead of time and look at applications and make sure that you're recording the information that you need based on the certifications that you want. Okay, so I've talked a bunch about certifications, and now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about job applications. So this is what Outward Bound Canada asks for as part of their job application. So you'd submit a regular resume and cover letter, and then they call this a trip log. But again, it's the same basic thing as the wilderness resume, experience Vitae that we've been looking at. So the application is in a spreadsheet with 3 pages, and I've just broken down, it's sort of like a long, skinny spreadsheet, so I've just broken it down into 2 rows so that it will fit on the PowerPoint better. So the first page asks for your professional experience, and as you can see, it's asking for similar information to what we've already gone over. Name of trip, activity, region, so a different word, but it's asking for the same information as the location, your role, number of nights, start and end date, participant demographics, number of participants, and the employer, which again is a different word, but it's asking for the same info as the organization. And they also have a section for you to comment on learnings from the trip. So the second page is your personal trip section. So it asks for, again, really similar information to what we've discussed with the who, what, when, where, and what of each trip. So this should look fairly familiar. And then the third page in this section is educational. And so this could include certification courses that you've taken, as well as training courses that don't have certification attached. So in this case, these courses can include both technical skills as well as facilitation skill courses. So the example that they've used is for a trauma-informed care training. They include a brief description of what that is, and then the logistical information about where and when the course was. So you could include any courses or trainings that you feel are relevant to working with people in the outdoors. So this is the version of the wilderness resume that Outward Bound Canada wants, and each job that you apply for might have some differences in exactly how it's formatted or exactly what they're asking for. But the general information is typically quite similar from organization to organization in terms of the overall picture of what they're asking for. So really just trying to get a sense of what professional work trips have you done, what personal trips have you done, what trainings and certifications do you have, and when did you do those, who did you do them with? All right, so we've covered a lot. Just to summarize, we discussed what a wilderness resume is, why they're used, when you might submit one, and what they look like and how you write one. And then we got into some specific examples of tailoring your wilderness resume for specific applications for either jobs or certifications. So this slide here has a QR code. If your phone's handy, or if not, at the bottom there is the Outward Bound Canada website. So as I mentioned at the start, I'm here with the Training Academy with Outward Bound. And so this is just some more information if you're curious to connect with more of our programs. We have both classroom-based learning as well as outdoor learning. All the information is on the website if you, again, go to that, that website or follow the QR code. And what's really awesome is our trips are funded. So that means it's free for participants. And we do, in the Rockies, we do backpacking trips that are 5 or 10 days long. There's also sea kayaking and canoeing trips that happen across Canada. So yeah, I'd encourage you to check out the website if you're interested and want to connect. And all of the photos that were in this PowerPoint are from my time working with Outward Bound in the Rockies. So all of the photos were places that yeah, that we go on outward bound trips. And so if you looked at that and thought, wow, that's so beautiful, I'd love to go there, yeah, check out the website, and it would be great to have you out on course with us. All right, so we've got some time here to move into questions. Again, my colleague Brandon is here with us, and so he is going to be helping moderate this part. And yeah, shall we roll right into it?
Yeah, thanks, Kat. That was awesome. I've got a bunch of questions from the chat or the Q&A. Folks were using that well. One question that came up is there an app that you're aware of to keep track on a rolling basis your trip log, or is it kind of just Excel spreadsheets and such?
Ooh, that's a great question. I unfortunately am a very not techie person, so I use a Word document, but I'm sure there are better ways out there. Yeah, Excel sheet, and then I mean, all that I use is a like a table on Word, so I'm sure you could do that in Notes. But yeah, I do some more research because there's probably some cool tech that could help with that.
Or some app developer out there that's like, aha.
Mhm.
I'm going to combine this question, two-parter. Would you recommend mentioning like all of your trips ever? You talked about personal experience, but like how far back would you recommend going? And when you're putting it on a resume, is there like a limit of pages that you might consider?
Yeah, great question. I'd say what I do is I include all my professional experience. So if it's a trip that I've been paid to work, it goes on the resume. I think the first professional section of my resume is like 7 or 8 pages long. But that's helpful again, just to have a really robust, detailed piece, as that's often used in kind of like position decision making. In terms of personal trips, I'd say use your discretion. So, a couple things. One is if you're trying to apply for a specific certification, look at the criteria and see what's relevant. So, for example, if you wanted to apply for rock climbing certification, um, they only are looking at grades, routes that are above a certain difficulty. So then it might not be useful to record, every single rock climb that you've done that's easier than that grade, because you're not actually going to be asked to submit it in your application. So if you're thinking about a cert, and you're deciding what to record, look at what the criteria is, and I'd say don't bother recording things that don't fit that criteria. Um, if you're not looking at a cert and you're just wanting to keep a general wilderness resume, it really depends kind of how much you're going out. Something you could consider is grouping things together. So for example, if let's say you go trail running 3 times a week, you might just say, the year or the season and say, running 3 times per week, um, 10 to 20 kilometers or 1 to 5 kilometers, whatever it is. And then it's just kind of one line that captures that, I did a total of 50 runs this year or 100 runs this year, depending how much you're going. And then it does sort of make it more legible than if you had every single time in like a million rows. You can kind of combine that similar information. Um, Anything to add to that, Brandon?
No, that last little bit there is what I would recommend. I've worked for an organization where over multiple years I did day hikes kind of in the same location. So I just lumped it together versus showing them the back end of things that has the nitty gritty details. If there's something that you've learned from those experiences from way back when, then I would say that could be relevant and worth including. But yeah, as far as I know, there's no real limit to how many pages you might include either. I'd say typically organizations are pleased that you have a trip log to begin with, and the more you can show, the better. Um, Questions that are kind of going along with that, Kat. We've got folks asking about experience prior to being age of majority. Should they include that as well?
Um, I'd say it depends how much experience you have after that. So if you're 18 or 19 years old and you have a bunch of experience from before you were legal age, um, that might be really useful. If you are 50 years old and so you have 32 years of experience between now and then, you might choose not to. And so I'd say it really is just a use your discretion piece on what makes sense. What's more recently relevant, as well as in the comments section, you can include anything like that. You could say, on this trip, I was a student or I was an assistant instructor, but I was 16 years old at this camp I worked for. So it's definitely still acceptable to include things from any age that you were, and then just try and capture a little bit in the comments some of the context again of what that role looked like and yeah, how old you were if you were a minor.
Great. In terms of kind of building experience, other than personal trips, is there anything you might recommend other than an outward bound experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really common question for people is like how do I get more experience that will move me towards these, jobs or certifications that I'm interested in? And I'd say there's a few main things you can think about. So the first is formal training courses. And so that could be hiring a private guide. It could be joining like a paid trip. If you look in your area, an activity that you're interested in, there's a lot of guiding outfits that will have group trips you can sign up for that are educational in nature. There's university programs out there that would be typically a 1, 2, or 4 year commitment to get that formal education in kind of more technical outdoor things. And so kind of like university courses, formal organization courses, you can think about community courses. So a lot of the time there's free programming that is volunteer based available, where it's like in the Rockies, we have the Alpine Club of Canada and they run events. And in other regions, there'll be different organizations, but you can kind of look around and see, yeah, who's running group meetups. If you don't already have a lot of friends or people in your community with experience, that can be a great way to meet people and kind of, yeah, blend those more formal outings or like organized outings with just going and doing things either by yourself or with your friends. So I'd say those are kind of like the different approaches that you might take, and often it's really helpful to combine them. So maybe you take a formal um, training course with an organization, and then after that, you plan a bunch of personal days to practice the skills, and then you take another course. And then again, if people are curious, really, I'll just plug the Outward Bound programs because those are a formal training course that is fully funded, and that's intended to sort of remove those financial barriers. Because for a lot of people, it's like, oh, I'd love to take these training courses, but they're so expensive. So yeah, keep your eyes out as well for training courses that do either have scholarships available or are funded.
Yeah, that's great. That was one of the last questions coming in through the chat is, are there grants or similar programs to pay for certain qualifications as they are expensive? And yeah, I'd recommend looking into like Canada Jobs. They have kind of sectoral initiatives or federal initiative rather, and certain organizations offer scholarships through their program. So applying to those directly is what I'd recommend. Is there any other ways to get grants or money that you're aware of personally, Kat?
I mean, I'd say the main thing is there are quite a few out there, and so just doing your research because there's grants that tend to be quite specific. You know, it's a grant for this particular type of certification for this particular demographic of participant. And so I'd say it is worthwhile to do a bit of an internet search to try and narrow down, okay, this is the certification I'm curious about. Where's the funding? I know, for example, MEC has different scholarships, Arc'teryx has different scholarships. So sometimes it's money that are coming from gear companies. But most of the time, that information will be available like through the organization that you're applying for. So, for example, when I applied for ACMG certifications, in the ACMG website, there's a link that has a list of the different scholarships that are out there, and then I could kind of go through and figure out like, oh, are any of these a fit between my demographics and what the scholarship is intended for?
Great. Another question here, and I'm only seeing about two others for us. So if there are any other questions, feel free to drop them in as we're answering them. But can a professional section include going on a trek as a photographer and not as a guide? Would that be relevant? Would you include it in the professional section of your trip log?
Great question. I mean, I would include it, and then because there's a section for role where we talked about, you know, assistant instructor, lead guide, you would just put photographer, and then in the comments, maybe explain a little bit about what that meant.
Great. And then oh, I did see one other one pop up. So when a job application asks for a resume, CV, and trip log, how much emphasis is put on the resume, considering the trip log will provide more details? Kind of considering those as two separate things. But what would you say, Kat?
Yeah, I mean, I would think of it as you want your cover letter and your resume to be just as strong as if that was the only thing in your application, but then you have this additional resource that goes through the details of the trip. Um, I think the resume can be really helpful because it's going to capture any work experience that's not related to the outdoor sector or any outdoor sector work where you didn't do field days or you didn't do the outdoor trips. And so in my mind, I kind of think of them. I think of the wilderness resume as a bonus in addition to piece. And I'd still try and have like a resume that I would submit on its own.
Yeah, I agree. Um, Final question that I see here is, does leading and instructing at a summer camp during the day count as field days? Um, I would say yes, depending on the programming, but
Yeah, totally. I think of a field day as days where you are outside with students or participants. Um, and then again, the kind of function of the comment section or some of those other columns is you can really paint that picture. So you can say, you know, the participant demographics will give a clue to that. Your role could be camp counselor. The activity might be day trips. You know, maybe in the comments you're distinguishing like, yeah, we'd go on 3 hour long afternoon hikes. I think that's still really great work experience, and valuable to include. Um, and in my experience, working with youth at summer camp is a fabulous way to learn facilitation and group management, because it's often quite large groups of kids with yeah, lots of different wants and needs, and it's a great learning platform. And so I think that is something that does get valued by organizations as well.
Definitely would recommend it. When a certification expires, should I just remove it from my resume?
Um, yeah, that's what I do. Although I suppose it could also be appropriate to just write the expiry date and have a little note that it has expired. I would say it really depends how long ago it expired as well. So if you have a certification that's expired within the last year that you're intending to recertify, then I'd say definitely just, note that it's expired and include it. If you have a certification that you did 10 years ago that you have no intention of renewing, then I'd say scrap it.
I agree. All right. Well, those were the final questions that have come through. Thanks for answering them all, Kat.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks everybody for being here. Really appreciate it. I hope that at least some of the tips and tricks in here have been helpful for you.